So this is practical digital security for journalists, and the emphasis is on practical. You may have run into security people who told you things that you couldn't use, and so we're gonna try to bring it back to stuff you can actually do in your newsroom and on your stories. And we're gonna do a little security tune-up today as well. So actually get you squared away as much as we can and familiar with some of the tools and techniques that we're going to try to use. There is a caveat. The caveat is that you can't actually learn digital security in an hour. This is a large topic. It's large, it's fast changing. Think of this more like legal advice, right? So a lawyer can't make you a lawyer in an hour, but they can get you to the point where you have a basic strategy and you know when you need to talk to an expert. So that's kind of my goal today. And you'll all have different situations as well, right? Like legal advice, there's no one size fits all. So what are we doing? This was a tweet from the Associated Press Twitter account in 2013. It briefly crashed the stock market. I don't know if many of you remember this, but their Twitter account had been hacked. We'll talk about actually how they did this in a few minutes. This is a case where rather than pressing on the reporter to reveal their sources, which is sort of like the classic courtroom drama, right? Like, you must tell us who did this. No, I refuse to. It's my integrity as a journalist. In the modern world, your integrity as a journalist doesn't really enter into it because there are so many other ways to go around that and look at communication records. So we're going to be talking about that a lot and how to operate in that environment. And ultimately, there are cases where someone's life could hang in the balance. So if you are reporting in a conflict zone, if you are reporting on, narco criminals in Central America, if you are reporting in places where the government will throw you in jail if they don't like what you print, these things can have real consequences. So that's kind of the framing of what we're doing. But I don't want to scare you. In fact, I want to give you a different frame, right? You can look at security as either reducing risk or making it possible to do things that you couldn't do before. If you have good security practices, you can do stories that might otherwise be too dangerous to do. So it's also an enabling technology. Oh yeah, there we go. I just said that. So this talk has basically two parts. One is basics. So by basics, what I actually mean is what everybody in the newsroom should be doing, even if you're not working on a sensitive story. And you'll see why it's important to have buy-in from the entire organization. And then part two is what I call recipes, how to deal with more specific situations that might arise in your reporting. So this is the basics slide, right? This is what everybody needs to know. And it breaks down into logins, phishing, encryption, and sharing settings. In particular, these first two things, logins and phishing, that might be somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 90% of actual security failures have to do with poorly secured logins and people falling for phishing. So if all you take away from this is turning on two-step logins and being able to recognize a phishing email, you'll be way ahead already. And these are fairly simple things. So logging in, we all have a lot of accounts. They're mostly protected with passwords. This is, we do this all day, every day. This is basic security. But it turns out that most people use passwords poorly. And we know this because every once in a while there's a big password database breach. Someone manages to retrieve the passwords from a large site, and they're often encrypted. In fact, they should always be encrypted, but you can sometimes decrypt them. And basically, people suck at passwords. You can get into some amazing fraction of the world's accounts by typing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or password. What I especially like about this one is we've got LinkedIn versus Gawker, and You would think the Gawker passwords would be the dirtier ones, but no, that is not the case. So this is very easy, right? So, as they say, don't be that guy, right? So use a real password. And a password that is not in the dictionary. Anyone know why dictionary words are a bad choice? Yeah, exactly. If a computer can guess, right? So yes, but passwords that aren't in a dictionary take longer and longer to guess because there's just many, many more of them. Um, so non-dictionary stuff, and the easiest thing to do is actually just put a few words together rather than trying to like change O's to zeros and I's to ones and so forth. If you have just 2 or 3 random words, it's actually a surprisingly huge number of possibilities. The other really key thing, and this is one of those like you are going to leave here today with this done, is two-factor authentication, also called two-step logins or multiple-factor logins. There's lots of names for this, but the idea is that you log in with something you know, which is your password, plus something you have. I mean, there's a bunch of somethings you have that you can do. The most common one these days is to use a little authenticator app on your phone. Sometimes it's also a little physical hardware device. Some of you have probably seen this sort of thing. And the idea here is that if someone guesses your password, tricks you into revealing it, hacks into another site where you're using the same password and figures it out, there's lots of ways a password can be exposed. But if they don't have the second part, right, your little authenticator code, then it doesn't do them any good. So that's basically the long and the short of this, right? Is use a real password, not a dictionary word. Use two-step logins. You might also consider password management tools. The issue here is that it's not safe to use the same password on every site, and the reason is one of those sites is eventually going to be hacked, right? And so if you have the same password on every site, then eventually somebody will know the password that you're using for your email. And there's actually a whole underground market of hacked password databases. So a lot of this stuff is less a question about whether someone has the technical skill and more a question of like how much money does someone want to spend to do this. If you do nothing else, make sure that your email password is different from all your other passwords, because your email password is the one password you use to reset everything else, right? Your options here kind of boil down to try to manually keep track of a different password on every site, or use a password manager, but at the very least use a different email password. Also, you shouldn't ever need to tell anyone your password. If anybody calls you and says, hi, I work in IT, we're trying to fix a problem with your account, we need your password, that person is an imposter. Phishing. Phishing is the major way that accounts are compromised, including journalists. Phishing is less of it's not a technical trick, it's a con, right? It's a deception. It relies on tricking you into revealing information or doing something else that the attacker needs you to do. You've probably seen versions of this. Phishing is occasionally very obvious, right? You get some message and you're like, okay, there's no way this isn't a scam, right? It's misspelled and it's just flat out asking for your password, right? And you're like, haha, I'm not going to fall for that. But it can get a lot more subtle than this, and it's becoming increasingly sophisticated. This is, incidentally, how the AP Twitter account was hacked. It was a phishing email, we think from the Syrian Electronic Army, which was this hacking group that was active a few years ago. It didn't do huge damage, but managed to do a few stunts like this. And we believe that this is or I believe, because I don't have inside information here, but I believe that this was the email that was involved. So take a look at this email. Seems very sort of benign, right? It's just like, here, check out this link. And one of the things that I want to point out is that the name has been removed, but it came from a real AP journalist, right? It didn't come from outside the organization. It came from, or appeared to come from, a colleague who was known to the recipient. What about this message might trigger your suspicion. How could you identify such an attack? Right, it's very non-specific, right? And so this is characteristic of a lot of phishing scams which spread through any channel, right? So there was a Twitter one that spread through Twitter direct messages a few years ago that said, "Oh my God, you have to check out these pictures of you," right? And so if you clicked on the link, you know, it took you to a fake Twitter login page. You typed in your password, and then they had control of your account, and they could send to all of your friends, and that's how the scam spread. And you've probably received weird emails like this every once in a while from a friend who then 5 minutes later sends an email saying, "Oh my God, I was hacked, don't answer to that," right? So that's what's going on there. The other way you can detect this is by looking at where the link goes. Now, this is a URL, right? WashingtonPost.com, blah, 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 blah. But we all know that the word that you click on is not the URL, right? If I have a link that says, you know, this is a delicious recipe for banana cake, right? And banana cake is highlighted. Banana cake is not the URL. There's some URL underneath that. So there's nothing that stops you from writing out a URL and making it go to a completely different URL. So the next piece of advice is watch where the link goes. This is another version of that. You may recall that John Podesta's email appeared on WikiLeaks during the election. But there was no magic there. There was just trickery, and this, in fact, is the email. Interestingly, because the email was linked, we have a copy of the email used to get into the account. So what's going on here? This is a fake email pretending to be a message from Google Security. Now, of course, Google Security does send emails like this. Maybe not exactly like this, but it's similar in form. And what's the tell here? What's the giveaway? Yes, the bit.ly link. So if it goes through a link shortener, that could go anywhere, right? If it's got either bit.ly or j.mp or t.co for Twitter, if there's any sort of link shortener, you actually have no idea where that link goes. An authentic link would be google.com. So that's the first tell. Now, actually, to Podesta's credit, he was suspicious enough to wonder whether this was genuine, and he forwarded it to his IT guy. And therein lies a sad tale, because his IT guy said, "Oh, you should change your password immediately. This email is legitimate." He had meant to say illegitimate, and so Podesta clicked on this link rather than going through the Google link. So for want of a nail, the election was lost. So these are attacks on journalists. There are also attacks on your sources, right? If you are working with sources who could be a target, then they will experience these types of phishing emails as well. This was an example from Syria a few years ago. And the most effective way to get somebody to click on something is to give them something they want, right? You know their political sympathies if they're against you if you were trying to attack them. So you just sort of give them what you want. So in this case, what actually happened is when you clicked on the link, it went to a fake Facebook login page that looked, of course, identical to the real login page because it's trivially easy to copy a website. And so the users just thought, oh, my login expired. I'm just gonna, log in really quick, and then I want to see this picture, this video, right? And so they collected rebels' Facebook logins in this way, and then they were able to read their Facebook accounts and see who their friends were, and basically trace through the entire network of resistance to the government, and intercept messages, and really had invaluable intelligence in this way. So one of the best defenses against this stuff is, as I've said, read the URL before you click. So here I am, I'm hovering over, I think it's, this word here. And modern browsers, when you point at a link, they will show you where that link is going to go. Different browsers work differently. On mobile, you can actually get the same thing if you just press and hold the link. It will show you where it's about to go. And so if you have, if you've got anything that is sort of remotely making you wonder about this, just actually read the URL where it's going. And then, of course, you need to be able to understand what is and isn't an authentic URL. So this is not PayPal. What's the giveaway? What's wrong with this URL? Right, exactly. So, something / PayPal is not PayPal. PayPal.something.com is not PayPal. It has to be the first part of the URL, the site name, has to end in PayPal.com. The other thing is that if you're up against a really dedicated adversary, they're going to exploit whatever personal information they can find to make the message appealing to you. So you saw earlier, in the Syrian example, right? There was, something that was designed to appeal to that particular person. In the AP example, what they actually did was they got into one staffer's account, right? So what you do is you send phishing emails to the entire company. One or two people respond. So now you have accounts, who knows what they are, right? They, it could be the driver, right? Like it doesn't matter. It just has to be someone in the organization. But now, once you have their account, you can send legitimate-looking emails to someone else, and you gradually work up the chain of trust until you reach your target. So this is why I've said that these principles need to be applied by everybody in the newsroom. It's because once you're inside, you can use that to reach the person who's actually working on the story. But there is a pretty simple counter strategy, which is just be aware, right? Notice this stuff is happening, and report it when you see it. So that's basically the long and short of it, right? So, suspicious and generic messages, checking the URLs, especially when you're typing in a password, right? I have a reflexive habit now of every time I type into a password, I just glance up at the URL to make sure I'm typing it into a genuine site. And if you can get into these habits, that will save you from probably 80 to 90% of the ways that you might be compromised.
Is simply going to a bad, sketchy URL enough to infect your computer, or is going to it and then inputting some information?
Great question. So in the vast majority of the cases, you have to do something. You have to type in some information, or maybe they want you to install a program on your computer, which also you should never do unless you're completely certain of the source. It is possible in some cases to mount an attack against your computer or sometimes even your phone just from going through URL. It's harder. If you are to do that, normally you have to invest serious time or money. So it really depends on how committed your adversary is into breaking your security. And if you're against someone who's willing to spend, tens of thousands of dollars or invest months, then you're sort of playing in a different realm, and then you have to worry about that sort of thing. But let's say for most threats that reporters face, the main problem is going to be tricking you into revealing information. If you are up against such a serious adversary where you're worried that just clicking on the link might be a problem, you can do things like have a computer that has no information on it, right? You just have this machine that has no information on it, and hopefully is not even connected to the same network, right? Is not on your internal network. So you have this safe machine that you can look at dangerous documents. Okay. Disk encryption. So what happens if your laptop is stolen? You've got a bunch of stuff on there, right? You've got documents and notes and your contact list. You've got stuff which you are legally or ethically obliged to keep confidential. Can the person who finds your laptop get at that? Well, presumably you all have a password on your login, right? So they can't just log in. But if you don't have disk encryption turned on, I can get at it with a screwdriver, right? I can open your computer, take out the drive, connect it to another computer. Now I have everything. So the solution to that is encryption, right? This scrambles the data on your drive with your password, so that even if I can physically take the drive out of the computer and connect it to something else, I don't get everything. And fortunately, this is tremendously easy now. This used to be tricky, but it's stupid simple now. Like two-step logins and phishing, the risk reward is makes this a huge payoff, right? So on Windows, it's called BitLocker. On Mac, it's called File Vault. You go into your settings, you turn it on, it trundles away in the background for a few hours, and you're done. That's it. This is the cheapest, easiest security that you will ever find. So all of you should have this. Your phones, external drives, USB sticks, basically anything with sensitive data on it, which almost definitely includes your phone, right? Needs to be encrypted. iPhones are now encrypted by default. I don't think you can even turn that on or turn that off. Android phones, it's still a setting that you need to turn on some versions of Android. So very straightforward, easy thing to do. The last easy thing that I'm going to talk about today, before we get into sort of how to look at defend against specific attacks, is your sharing settings. So I'm talking about both social media and also cloud storage. One of the main ways that accounts are compromised is someone logs in through an old account. So you were working on this story, and you set up this, you gave someone access to your notes folder because you needed them to be able to collaborate, and it was all great, right? But now it's 3 years later, and they still have access to this main folder, right? So there's two parts of this. It's like, who has access and also to what? And it's kind of hidden from you who has access to what, because as you can see in this image, right, it's like, well, and 3 other people, right? And so we're talking, by cloud storage, I mean, Google Drive, Dropbox, there's one that's just called Box, iCloud, even SharePoint. Like, there's tons and tons of places where you're maybe storing files. The trick here is to think about first of all, when you grant access, grant only the minimum amount of access required. So rather than granting someone access to your whole account, make folders by project. So this is a basic security principle, which is compartmentalization, right? You want to give people access only to the things that they're actually going to need to do. And then when the project finishes, think about, well, who still needs access? Right, so I have students. I give students, this incoming students every year access to certain document archives that we maintain at Columbia that we use for reporting and to collaborate with our partners. When they graduate, I revoke those accounts, because otherwise I have 20 people going out into the world, and it's not so much a question of whether I trust them. It's more, do I trust them to protect their accounts? Because if someone gets into their account, right, then they can get it back into my account. So that is something that actually we're going to do today as well, is to take a look at these settings. And then this is, I suppose this is more privacy than security, but you're all journalists. You're all in the job of investigating people. Have you ever tried to investigate yourself? This can be a very illuminating exercise. All right, so you can use someone else's computer, or an incognito or private browsing window, which means that you're not logged in as you, and just background yourself, right? And it's not so much that these things are good or bad, right? Like, we are all public figures to some extent because we are journalists. So you can't lock down everything all the time, but it's more about being aware of what is and isn't available. And so, how many of you have looked at this screen recently, right? This is the Facebook sharing screen. Every social media platform has something like this. And much like looking at old sharing settings for cloud storage, it's really worthwhile to periodically review your sharing settings on social media and ask questions that maybe you wouldn't think about, like, how far who can look at my old posts? Who can look at the stuff I posted 5 years ago? These types of questions. Or, as you can see, who can look me up is a big question as well. And if you want a really fun example of this, there's the story of how a Gizmodo reporter found the FBI director's Twitter and Instagram accounts, right? I really recommend reading it. It's really enlightening about, first of all, it's fantastic sort of practical investigation process, right? So you should know this as journalists. And second of all, it tells you a lot about where the holes are and how you might want to plug them to protect yourself and your organization and your sources. Okay. So I've given you a number of specific things to do, sort of basic strategies that everybody should be doing. I want to give you a conceptual framework for thinking about security, right? This is how the professionals do it. And this is, rather than giving you sort of a bunch of disconnected tactics, this is how you have a security strategy. The idea is this. There's no such thing as just security in the abstract, right? It is security against who doing what how. So these are the questions that you should be asking yourself as you're trying to design a security strategy for a particular story or a project or your organization as a whole. So the first question is, what are you protecting? What data are you protecting, right? And there's some stuff that's fairly obvious, right? You want to protect your notes and any confidential information they've given you. There are some things that's probably less obvious. For example, your contact list, right? This is one of the things that sort of came to public consciousness with the Snowden stuff a few years ago. Metadata, meaning who is talking to who, is almost as valuable, if not more so, than the content of the messages themselves. Because if you think about a leak investigation, you don't really need to know what someone said to a reporter. That comes later. First, you need to know who was talking to a reporter. So your contact list, which is in several different places, right? It's on your computer, it's in your email account, it's on your phone, is actually extraordinarily valuable information. And then there's the issue of privacy versus anonymity, right? We'll get into this a little bit later, but the difference is that anonymity means that your adversary, that is the person who wants to find out, doesn't know who you're talking to. Privacy is just they don't know what you're saying. And so you have to decide which one do you need. And then there's the question of, well, who is it? Who does want to know? We've all heard a lot about three-letter agencies. For most of you, for most stories, you're not concerned about the FBI or the NSA or the CIA or the KGB or the GRU or the FSB or whatever, right? That's not your problem. More likely, your problem is the subject of the story, a competitor, local law enforcement, these types of things. Without asking who your adversary is, you can't plan how to defend against it. There's also sort of more general threats that aren't specific to you in particular. There's just like, people will get your credit card number if they can, right? People will get your passwords if they can because there's a black market for stolen data. So there's also the more general threats. Then you have to ask, how can they get this information? Your adversary is the person who's trying to break your security, who's trying to get information. Okay, how do they do it? So this is a good moment to scope our conversation today. This lecture is about digital security. Digital security is a subset of security in general, right? If you don't care about your password if someone is threatening you physically, right? So security for journalists also includes your physical safety. It also includes legal security, right? How do we prevent our organization from getting sued into non-existence, as happened to Gawker? And similarly, when you ask what your adversary can do, yeah, it's sort of very sexy to think about advanced hacking techniques, but nobody's going to bother to do that if they can get what they want by suing you and forcing you to reveal it through discovery, right? Or why would I even bother with any of that if I can make a phone call, pretend to be IT, and get you to give me your password? Or walk into your office at lunch and see if there's a computer with an unlocked screen, right? There's lots and lots of different ways. So as a general categorization, you can think about technical, legal, social, and physical. And you have to protect against all of these vectors, right? It's not just about like setting passwords and encryption and stuff. It's also like who can get in the door. And I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean physically, who can get in the door. And steal your laptop, for example. And then there's this question of sort of what happens if your security fails, right? There is no one-size-fits-all security. It's never free. So there's the question of why are we bothering, right? And the point of this question is both to give you the incentive to have the level of security that you need, and also it's a way of thinking about the ethics of the situation, right? What are the consequences if I fuck this up, right? If you're obtaining documents from a source who might get fired if they are discovered, that's a different situation than if you're obtaining documents from a source who might be put in jail if they are discovered, right? And so, I propose do no harm as an ethical principle for working with sources. And this is the question, can I actually make good on my promises? Okay, so now that I've given you now the principles that everybody should be doing, including the non-journalists in your organization, right? Everybody, the janitor should have two-factor authentication on their email, right? Like that's a vulnerable account. And I've given you sort of how to construct a strategy. What I'm going to give you now is a whole bunch of recipes for solving specific problems. Communications, storage, leaks, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to go through this quickly. You will have access to the slides, so you can, and me, and there's lots of resources. So I don't really expect you to retain all of this. It's more about pointing you in the directions to certain types of solutions. Okay, so, oh my God, here's what we're going to talk about in not very much time. But these are all specific circumstances and things that you're going to need to do or may need to do as a reporter. The first thing I want to talk about is I mentioned what I called legal attacks, using the courts, essentially, to get access to your data. Well, in the US, there is a legal doctrine known as the third-party law, which says that if you give your data to anyone else, there is no Fourth Amendment protection. So while law enforcement needs to get a warrant to search your laptop, they don't need to talk to you at all to get the data from someone else. Now, in practice, most large cloud storage companies will require a warrant or some sort of subpoena or the proper legal instruments before they reveal any personal information, but they don't have to. They're under no legal obligation to do that. And even if they do require subpoenas or warrants before they'll give up information, as Google and Facebook and Dropbox and basically everybody does, they're under no obligation to notify you or fight on your behalf. So this is a fundamental problem, right? It's the problem of data you control versus data you don't. And you want your lawyers to be in front of any attempt to get at this, which means if you have data where there might be a legal attack, you got to store it yourself. You can't really use third-party services if you want your lawyer to be the one defending you. There is a certain amount of transparency around requests from large technology companies from governments for information. And they actually publish this globally, so you can just go and look. How many times did Google respond to a request, and how many users were implicated, and what type of instrument were they responding to? So you can go look this up, and you can get a fairly good idea of how much information they're turning over. And honestly, most of this is mundane, right? I don't want to do this ooh, we're all being surveilled sort of paranoia. This is, when you look into this stuff, it's more about there's a missing child and we're doing an investigation, right? It's normally stuff that you really would want them to cooperate with law enforcement. Be that as it may, you still need to protect your legal rights, and that means potentially putting your lawyers in front of data that is stored on your servers and not theirs. In particular, this applies not just to cloud storage, but communications, right? So if someone asked about Slack, right? If you're typing stuff through Slack, you have no protection of that, right? It's not only can Slack read it, but Slack will hand it over if asked. So I would recommend that if you were using an insecure communication channel, such as Slack, such as Facebook Messenger, such as most things, really, you assume that anything that you type into that is going to appear in court. So that is exactly what happened to Gawker. So Gawker, you may recall, was forced to pay $100 million, which bankrupted them, over the publication of a Hulk Hogan sex tape. And this is a partial transcript of what they were talking about, and not Slack, but Campfire, similar collaboration tool, in 2012. And this was read at trial to prove that, they were not treating this as an overriding public interest to see the sex tape, that it was, purely prurient, and it was an invasion of privacy. So the right way to think about this is anything that you type into a computer, imagine it being read in court, right? So maybe you should think about having more non-recorded conversations, like phone calls, and less things with logs. And if you do things which keep logs, think about how often you want to erase those logs, right? What you really want is a data retention policy. You want a standardized policy. We delete all chats weekly, or something like that, right? Because otherwise you can get into a situation where it looks like you were hiding something by deleting that particular chat. And there are tools that can help you to do this. So that gets us to, well, okay, how do we communicate securely when we need to? And this is kind of the breakdown. I'm going to go through different communication channels, but text messages are really popular and great. And I've sort of listed the methods here from least to most secure. So SMS is awful because it's unencrypted and you can pick it up through the air, all the way to things like iMessage or Signal, which the company that operates the platform doesn't have any access to it. And then the middle ground is, it goes through some company servers, and they may or may not be able to read it. So most chat apps, they are not, there's this phrase end-to-end encrypted. What that means is it's encrypted as it leaves your phone or your computer, and it's decrypted before the recipient reads it. But everyone in the middle, including the servers and the companies who operate the servers, can't read it. One phrase that I like to say is, your data is only as secure as the creepiest employee, right? So, and again, it's not just about like whether Google are like nice people or something. It's like, what is the security profile of all of their employees? How much money are they going to put into fighting a subpoena? This type of thing. So this sort of the scale. As I mentioned, you can pick up SMS over the air. It's awful. Just don't use it if you can avoid it. Everyone know what I mean by SMS as opposed to text messages? It's the old school, like you don't even need a smartphone to do this, like straight up text message. On an iPhone, it appears green instead of blue. And in fact, I recommend that you turn off the send as SMS setting if you're using an iPhone or iPad. Because by default, if it can't get a data connection and you try to send a message, it'll fall back to SMS. That's really dangerous. Obviously, if you have no option and it's, if the reward is greater than the risk, then go for it, right? What I'm trying to impress upon you is that if you end up using SMS, it is much easier to eavesdrop than almost any other method of communication. And so this setting, I recommend everybody turn this off because otherwise it will automatically switch back to SMS by itself, which is really nasty. So it goes from iMessage, which is one of the more secure ways you can communicate, to SMS, which is like the least secure. You've all heard of Signal, I think. Signal is sort of the gold standard in secure messaging. It is end-to-end encrypted as using the same technology as WhatsApp, actually. In the last year, WhatsApp completed or switched to using the Signal encryption protocol for all of their messages, which is wonderful because many, many people use WhatsApp, right? And so WhatsApp is a pretty good go-to source communication technology because almost everybody already has it, and it's very nicely encrypted. There is still an advantage that Signal has as compared to WhatsApp, which is that Signal very deliberately does not keep any record of who is talking to who. So we know that because when Signal was asked to give up information, they were legally compelled to do so, and they did. But this is all that they got, right? They were asked for. By the way, this is pretty typical for this type of subpoena. Subscriber name, address, telephone numbers, email address, method of payment, IP registration, IB history logs and addresses, account history, toll records, upstream and downstream providers, any associated accounts acquired through cookie data, and any other contact information from inception to the present for the following accounts. So think about that list, right? If there's a subpoena coming through, they will get everything that they can. And the nice thing about Signal is that's all they had. They just had account creation date and last usage date. That's it. Right, so exactly. The disadvantage of Signal is that you have to get them to use Signal, and it's not a great chat app. You know, it's kind of low featured. I'm going to start pushing questions to the end because we're really running out of time here. So WhatsApp is a pretty good fallback, but this hopefully clarifies what the difference is, right? So if this is a credible threat, then you should think about Signal. If you're okay with like maybe having a subpoena that says, oh, well, you know, this reporter was talking to this person and, you know, WhatsApp is owned by Facebook, right? So Facebook's going to reveal this stuff if they have to. But at least they won't know what you're saying. Email. You know, you've probably heard people talk about GPG and sort of methods for encrypted email and so forth. That's like the most complicated way to have a secure communication. The other problem with email is that it is a big target. It's the first thing an attacker is going to try to get access to. It's used for password resets. It's archived. It's basically the least secure medium to communicate in, full stop. With that caveat, if both ends of the conversation are always using a reasonably secure platform, then it can be all right. So if both ends always use Gmail, then that can actually be a pretty good option because Google's security is quite good. It still won't protect against a subpoena, maybe, right? So for example, Gmail is a pretty good method to communicate inside China because Gmail doesn't answer subpoenas from the Chinese government. So that can be okay, and there's other sort of secure email services. But in general, if you need to have secure conversations, I recommend not using email if at all possible. And part of the problem is this. Email kind of looks like it just goes from one computer to another, but it really doesn't. It goes through all of these intermediaries, including like corporate networks, and then the sender's email server, and then the internet as a whole, and then the receiver's email server, and any one of those people could potentially look at it. This is how I want you to think of email, right? You're sending a postcard. Anybody who handles that postcard in transit can read it. So not the greatest medium. Phone calls. Phone calls leave logs of who you talked to. That may or may not be a problem, right? Again, the key question, as we talked about in threat modeling, is who has access, right? Well, certainly law enforcement has access, right? They can send a subpoena to the phone company. In some countries, the telecommunications company is also the state, right? So, if you're working in Egypt and making phone calls, the Egyptian state basically has that information immediately. And again, this is not a theoretical risk, right? This is, there's no reason to press upon the reporter to reveal a source if you can just get the phone logs, which happened in the case of this FBI agent who talked to the AP. So you may actually remember this. The Department of Justice subpoenaed the AP's phone records. They just said, let's see everyone who ever called you. There are ways to make a phone call that are, first of all, encrypted, but second of all, don't leave metadata. And so Signal is such a place. It has a little phone icon. WhatsApp will also let you make phone calls, and they are encrypted, but Facebook may retain a log of the fact that the conversation occurred. So if you really have to make a phone call that leaves no traces, unfortunately your best option right now is Signal, which can be awkward to get a source to use, but certainly you can use it between reporters. Okay. Handling confidential data, right? How do you share confidential data with your collaborators, your colleagues, and how do you store it? First of all, don't send sensitive files by email. Email is awful. It's unencrypted. It's archived. Just don't. And I know you want to, but don't. The next level up is sort of cloud services. So if you're okay sort of trusting the cloud service, you're putting sensitive stuff in Google Drive. If you think Google's not a credible threat, if you think it's not going to be subpoenaed, then just do it through Google Drive. It's fine. Interestingly, you can send files through iMessage, which anybody on Apple hardware has. So and Apple, I've actually spent a little while nailing this down. Apple is not able to decrypt your iCloud or iMessage contents. They can't actually do it, which means that this is actually quite a secure way to share and send information. But then there's the second part, which is often neglected, which is what do you do with the files once you have them? And what intelligence agencies did before the digital era was they had paper copies of a sensitive document, and they numbered them, and there was a log which said where each copy was. So the same principle applies in the digital era, is you have to know how many copies there are and where they are. And then you have to think about not just like where they are, like they're on the cloud or whatever, but like physically, where are they, right? If I steal your phone and I break into your phone, what do I get? Or where is the USB drive? Like, is it in your pocket, right? Is it in your desk? Is your office secure? These types of questions. How many copies is kind of a hard thing to keep track of. You have backups, you have cloud sync, you have attachments. You take a photo on your phone and then it's uploaded to your your Facebook stream or your Google Drive stream or whatever. This is something you actually have to think about and put a little more thought and control over if you're dealing with sensitive information. But that's the basic technique, right? How many copies? Where are they? And then, of course, you have to prevent physical access to the physical storage media. Now, there is a little bit of legal protection in the US. There's this thing called the Privacy Protection Act from, I think, 1980, which basically requires a higher legal standard for basically the cops to come in and confiscate your data. It's unclear whether this applies to like third-party cloud storage stuff. But it seems to be, overall, that if you're storing the data on your person or your premises, you have much better protection. So consider that for higher security problems. Anonymous sources. So first of all, we need to talk about what anonymity is. Anonymity is not to be confused with privacy. Anonymity is actually quite difficult to do in the modern era because everything leaves traces. And the especially difficult problem is that it only takes one slip up or one previous non-anonymous interaction to give you away, right? So the problem is you're working on a story and you have the source and you're talking and then you're like, oh, but now we're about to have a sensitive conversation. Let's switch to an anonymous channel. Well, that's great, but there's already a record of your previous communication. So if you really want to do anonymity, you have to be anonymous from the start, and that's difficult. So this is sort of the metaphor I want you to think about, right? An encrypted message is like a sealed envelope. Anybody can still read the address, and sometimes the address is all you need because you just want to know who they were talking to. That's what anonymity is. It keeps the identity private, not just the message contents. And this is tough because, as I said, you sort of have to start from the beginning. This is a quote from Barton Gellman, who you probably know as a national security reporter. This was his comment at a security conference, actually a hacker conference. Setting up these like crazy secure channels of communication at the first meeting with a source can be off-putting because the source doesn't want to believe that they're doing anything wrong and probably isn't at that point. So unfortunately, there is only one good solution to this problem, and you're not going to like it, which is don't ever use a non-secure channel. Right? That's really the only thing that you can do. So Gmail can be okay if your adversary is not likely to be able to get information from Google. Otherwise, you're sort of down to iMessage or Signal. Those are really the only channels that exist that won't leave any traces. So and then there's various fallbacks, right? So I try to use WhatsApp for if they don't have iMessage for my day-to-day conversations because at least it's encrypted end-to-end, and I don't know how much metadata they stored, but you know, at least they're thinking about security. You could probably press upon Facebook to ask who I messaged. And I often have frame the conversation with the source like this. I am a journalist. I care about the privacy of everyone I talk to. I care about your privacy. I would like to communicate in this way. So the idea is you have to set it up from the word go, because otherwise a year down the line, when they're actually giving you something where they might get in trouble, there's this whole trail that someone could look up. Anonymous browsing. Every computer has a thing called an IP address. It's a number, which is like their address on the, it's what they use to route data, right? You can go to whatismyip.com and you can see your IP address at any point. It reveals both location down to sort of, the sort of sub-city level, right? But also potentially identity, because if you always log into your email account from the same address, and then you go and log into something else from that same address, then I can figure out that it was you. You've probably seen like private browsing or incognito browsing. That does not change your IP address, right? It does not solve this problem. It affects cookies, which are, you've probably heard about this, right? Little sort of tracking codes. It's also how you stay logged into a site without entering your password each time. And it prevents what you go for looking at your browser history, but it doesn't solve any of these other problems. To be brutally honest, the private browsing mode is for looking at porn. It's not for doing secure work, right? That's the level of threat you're protecting against. Okay. However, there are ways to browse anonymously. What you want is a thing called Tor. How Tor works is it routes the signal through a bunch of intermediate computers, so it can't be traced from either end. There is a thing called the Tor browser bundle. It's basically a version of Firefox that routes through the Tor network. And so this is a very effective way to mask your IP address if you need to prevent someone from knowing where you're connecting, or that it is the same person connecting over and over. Here's a real-world example of that. This is from a ruling on a corruption case in New York State, and what I want to point your attention to. So we always in the security community sort of knew this was a theoretical risk, but now we actually have a real-world example. The subject of the story knew that a reporter was writing a story because the reporter had visited their website repeatedly. So think about whether you need to protect against that, and if so, you can use the Tor browser when you're visiting that website. Leaking. Leaking is so hot right now. The Trump administration seems to use leaking as a way to circulate draft memos because they aren't actually talking to the departments that the White House normally talks to. It's a very strange moment politically, and there's a lot of leaks, and there will, I think, continue to be leaks throughout all of the subsequent history of journalism. Normally the issue is keeping the source anonymous. As I mentioned, keeping someone's identity secret is hard. There is also the question of how you physically move the data. And having gone all up and down on this, I have to say that the best strategy is still a face-to-face meeting with a handoff. you want them to hand you a USB key. Preferably an encrypted USB key, so that if they lose the key, they are stopped in transit, or you lose the key, no one knows what it is, right? So handing off an encrypted USB key, and by the way, you can turn on BitLocker or File Vault on USB key, right? So your computer already has software on it to encrypt a USB key. That's really the way to go. If you need to let people leak to you over the internet, many news organizations now have secure drop instances. It's a piece of open source software maintained by the Freedom of the Press Foundation. And this provides an anonymous way to submit documents, and also anonymous two-way messages. So it's actually a very good way to have an anonymous communication with a source. It requires the source to connect using the Tor browser. So it prevents your web servers from keeping a log of where the source is connecting from, which means if you're subpoenaed, you got nothing. So it's as secure as you can do. It's basically an operationalization of the technique that WikiLeaks developed. They were the first group to sort of work with this like zero knowledge leaking system. But then you have the problem of publishing anything that you're given. And you can't just publish a document that somebody gives you, because that document has invisible data which can be used to identify them. You have to remove that information before you can publish it. There are tools to do this, but actually one of the simplest and most reliable ways to do it is open the document on your computer, not their computer, and take a screenshot of it. The thing about a screenshot is it is literally what you see is what you get. The problem with metadata is it's hidden information. As soon as you print it out or take a screenshot, there cannot be any hidden information. So for example, PDF or Word files, when you create the file, it stores the author name in it. This can really be a problem with photographs. Very often there's location data in photographs. In fact, the Associated Press turns off the GPS on all of their cameras to prevent these sorts of problems. And so here's a real-world example where a reporter posted a photograph and revealed the location of a source who was hiding from law enforcement. Right? So there's no excuse for this. This is just sloppy. So as I said before, don't be that guy. Location. Sometimes the thing you want to protect is not an identity, it's not a message, but it's where you are. So, location information, photos. You can geotag your social media posts. I think every social media platform turns this off by default, but you want to check that it is off. And phones themselves record your location. The phone company knows your location because they know which cell towers you're using to communicate. So they actually have your location down to a few hundred feet. So they know what city you're in where, and who you met with. They can look at two phones coming together and figure out who you're communicating with. Again, is that a problem? It depends on whether your adversary can get access to the phone records. Geotagged posts, probably not a real problem, but good to know about. But really what you want to do is you want to look at your location privacy settings. So you can, on your phone, look at which apps can access your location and whether they can do it continuously, which is really spooky, or just when you're using the app. So this is part of the security tune-up that we're going to do, is you're going to check your location settings. The last thing I'm going to talk about, so much material here, crossing borders. Borders are difficult security problems because you can be searched and you usually have reduced legal rights. There's a bunch of Supreme Court decisions that basically say you don't have Fourth Amendment protections when you're crossing the US border, even if you're a citizen. Now, they can't prevent you from coming back into the country if you're a citizen, but they can certainly pressure you to reveal your information. And searches of your phone and other electronic devices are on the rise. They were increasing even before the Trump administration. Now they're increasing faster. So there's basically two things you can do, encryption and backups. Now, encryption is not going to prevent border agents from getting into your files. because they can coerce you to give up passwords. So the point of encrypting your data when you cross the border, it is hard to resist a demand for a password because they might be able to deny you entry, they can make your life difficult, you might not have access to a lawyer who can defend your rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you'll at least know whether they got in there or not, and that itself can be very valuable. There is a border crossing guide that the Electronic Frontier Foundation has published, which goes into this in quite some detail, and I really recommend reading it. But the safest strategy by far is just don't carry sensitive material across borders. Ship it home across the network and walk across the border with a clean device. That's really the best approach here. Okay, ready? This is everything we've talked about today in one slide. You have access to the slides, so you can always look back to it. So, logins, phishing, encryption, sharing, everyone should be doing this. Everyone in the organization, not just you. For strategy, threat modeling. For communications, iMessage, WhatsApp, or Signal if you can. If you need to keep sources anonymous, you have to plan for it. You can't do it retroactively. And finally, for handling data, you have to have this inventory. And the last thing I will lead you with is how to get more information, including, new since last year, things are improving, the excellent tinfoil.press discussion forum for all of the paranoid journalists. Everyone is on there who talks about journalism security, and it's a great place for advice or discussion. Okay, I will be overjoyed to talk to you during lunch. In fact, it is HTTPS. It will redirect if you go to it. Good catch. Yeah. Yeah. And if you try to go to HTTP, it'll switch you. All right. I know that's a lot of information. I don't expect you to, have all of it in your head, but I'm happy to talk to you for as long as you like during lunch. And that's it. Thank you.